Welcome to Woke Free Christianity. My name's Jason, and this is the great and very Reverend Emery Causey.
Very, very reverend.
And this is Woke Free Christianity. What are we talking about today, Emery?
Well, I thought with Pride Month, it's now a month
Really?
coming on, I thought we would talk about sexuality. How does that
Let's talk
sound?
about sex, baby. Let's talk about you.
So we're going to have a little
Can
bit
you
of
sing
fun.
that on? Are we gonna?
So, this is obviously one of the largest issues on the woke pantheon. And this is probably the one people have the most passion for, at least in our Western culture. And so I thought it would be good if we took a look at it from a biblical perspective. And how did we get where we are? Because we are in a really different time than even when I grew up. So I thought instead, and again, you have to understand that underneath all of this, people might say, well, why don't you talk about homosexuality or some other sexual idea? It's all wrapped up in the same basic fundamental ideology. So once you understand the ideology, you can discern all the different expressions of sexuality in the alphabet, right? Which is
spectrum, right?
Continues to grow, right? I saw a picture the other day, and it had a number on it, like LGBTQ, and then I think it said 2 or something, and I was like, I don't know any of that. So, but I do know the ideology, so I thought we'd start
Ever
with that.
expanding, hey?
It is an expanding, which makes sense once you understand the ideology, because it's all based on individual self, right? So when you get into self and proclivities, then you get all kinds of expressions. I'm sure it'll continue to grow, so. Yeah, so I thought we would get into that, and how did we even get here? And I thought what we could potentially look at is, first of all, the concept of sexuality is always wrapped up with worship. Okay, so that's something that in the history of biblical and ancient Near Eastern ideology, sexuality is always wrapped up with worship of a god or gods.
Like
it
temple
always is.
prostitution, or
Exactly.
The Asher pole.
So what we have now, it's still worship, but it's a worship of a new ideology, but it's no less expressive in the same way. Now, so when you get into the concept of sexuality today, it's mostly to do with your inner leanings. So are you heterosexual? Are you what is it called? Heteronormative or something? I don't know. Heterosexual, homosexual, all of these things are wrapped up within who you are on the inside. So you could be bisexual. In the ancient world, sexuality was an act. So it was a verb. It wasn't, and I'll explain why we've changed that. And what sexuality was an act you would do in the form of interacting with someone in your neighbor, and mostly it was wrapped up in worship, as I said. Now, when you look at the ancients' view of sexuality and the temple, and you started off very well by noticing that how their temple prostitution existed, their idea of sexuality was based on turning on the gods. I know that sounds odd in our worldview, but their gods, pagan means earth. They were earth worshipers. These are people who lived off the land. And the idea was that if you actually read the ancient gods, they're very human-like, as you might imagine. They've got a lot of human characteristics: anger, jealousy, pride, and obviously lust. Lust is a very big thing. And you've read many of the myths of the gods having sex with a female human and creating Thor or some sort of being. Hercules, I think, is the one. Well, what you would do when you would have this worship is the idea was you would go into the temple and act out different sexual acts, usually under the influence of something, and there would be temple prostitutes. But your purpose for that action was to entice the god so that the god would ejaculate, and that would express itself through rain, and that would help keep your crops. So that's the fundamental understanding of temple worship.
Well, that's a whole different definition to reigning overall.
Yeah. I mean, it is odd. I mean, it's really hard for us to understand how they thought. But this was in their core being. And marriage then was very much considered a kind of outside of Israel, it wasn't a covenantal system. Marriage was a legal system that often oppressed women, that would serve their man, as it were. In many cases, because there were multiple gods, it was not bad to have multiple women in your life. And so paganism, part of the a whole part of it is there's multiple gods, right? And so when you get polytheism, multiple gods, you end up with polygamy, which you get the idea of marriage, and that's where that all comes in. Now, the Jews were different. We know that. The Jews believed in one God, and that was very important to be expressed through a covenant between themselves and one God. That's why adultery is such a sin in the Torah, because it represents a heart that has gone away from the one God, because you're expressing it in your life and you're having multiple partners, means you're like worshiping multiple gods. So monogamy is connected with worship within Israel. And that's how the ancients looked at the world. Obviously, they didn't live as long as we do. They didn't have the time to sit around and worry about proclivities as much. There is some evidence in the Greeks, by the time the Greeks come around, that there is this idea of romantic attraction between same sex. But again, that's not the norm, and we must understand that. So when we're tackling issues like this and we come to Scripture, we have to see it through that lens. Now, for the Bible, the whole concept of sexuality deviance is wrapped up with idolatry, the idea of worshiping gods that are not God. And that shows itself through the sexual proclivities or actions. So the fundamental issue within the Scripture is that you worship the one true God by bearing this God's image. And the creation story is very clear about what that looks like. And Jesus testifies to this when it says, and the two shall become one flesh. That's the concept of the covenant being made. It's reflective of the covenant between God and humanity. And the idea is that when you lay with a person, and that's the Old Testament language, you would become in a covenant relationship with that person. So for a Jew, the actual ceremony of marriage is not where the marriage happens. The marriage happens in the bedchamber when the two become one flesh. And the idea, again, is that
That happened when you had a piece of paper.
Sorry?
It's like marriage happens when that paper is signed.
Well, that's the Greeks, though. That's okay. The Greeks. So the Greeks very much, that's where we inherited the Greek legal system. And, of course, that's what our whole foundation is. But for a Jew, and I remember telling a bunch of youth at a youth group that, when you sleep with someone, you're in covenant with them biblically. And that shocked some of them because apparently they had a few
marriages,
what they call a body count. And
I heard someone the other day said if you're talking to them about body count and they know what you're talking about, first red flag.
Yeah, I only found out, like, it's not that we were innocent in my day at all, or that I was, but that language of body count is new. And it's because I was watching some sort of podcast and these young guys and young girls, and they were talking about body count. And one girl said over 100.
Yeah.
I mean, that's insane.
Yeah.
You know?
I think I know the podcast you're talking about.
Yeah, I forget what the name is. Sorry. And it was just a clip, right? Like it was just over 100. Anyway.
But it's interesting hearing the thoughts of some of these younger people on sexuality and what it is, right? And seeing kind of the long-term effects of that lifestyle. Like we have a lot of information now over like 30, 40 years of looking at society and living for sexual desire, where it takes you. And here we are at this stage.
Right. And the way we come at it, though, is very different now. In the sense of we have sexuality is located within ourselves. And that is a big difference. Sexuality was an act.
From the pagan viewpoint.
Viewpoint. Well, it's modern paganism, but it has a different view. And what happened was the Enlightenment. And once the Enlightenment begins, the whole concept, if you just continue to study, it's not that there wasn't homosexual behavior before, of course not. But the whole concept of you're having this inner self as a sexualized self is very modern. And what happens is you get, and I've used him before, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a good example. There are some precursors to him, but he's the one that really articulates this idea that the true, authentic self is who you are in and of yourself, and that the outside world puts constraints on that true, authentic self. And to be truly yourself, you must express who you really are inside. That sounds very modern, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And the outside world is putting these pressures on you from stopping you. And he talks a lot about, being the authentic people before we brought in society as the ultimate end. Okay, so that's kind of this idea of the primitive native as being good, because he or she doesn't have these impulses to stop. He starts this movement, and it's very much a movement that takes hold because of the religious wars. People start to become suspicious of religious authority, so they're looking for a new way. They begin to rediscover a lot of the Greek philosophers. And what we find over time is that the self then, I think, therefore I am, famous Rousseau, the I becomes God again. So the I, the internal. But he wouldn't have thought of this necessarily through sexual terms. Then you end up going through this time, and the next guy that really makes a difference is Freud. Freud is your guy.
So Rousseau, what time frame was that?
Oh, 16th, 17th century. Yeah, and now Freud doesn't show up till the 19th century, but he makes a huge impact. What Freud does, even though a lot of his theories have been debunked, what he's done to the cultural conscience is he locates the sexuality within yourself. So when he's working through issues with people who are adults, he always locates his theories that you were somehow oppressed. Again, you've got that oppression outside at a certain stage in your development. And as a child, you have these different sexual kind of urges, anal stage, oral stage. These all sound fairly familiar. And that you need to work these things out to be a truly self-actualized person, right? And of course, Freud is an absolute atheist. He comes at it from a perspective that our natural selves are the best expressed when we can do what we want in those areas, and there's something in us that is the natural sexualized self. And that whatever that appetite is good. It's only not good if it's repressed. So you begin to see the contemporary idea of how bad it is to repress sexuality, because that ends up with a damaged psyche. Okay. So Freud influences the world incredibly in that way. Again, his ideas have been thrown out. Now you throw in Mr. Marx. Marx was an interesting guy because, again, he doesn't really care about sexuality. He's all economics. His whole worldview is that the proletariat, which again is the working class, are being abused by the bourgeoisie, the landowners, factory owners, and we need to awaken to this reality, and then there'll be a revolution where this outside force, the bourgeoisie, can be conquered by the proletariat who is awoken. You tie in Freud and Marx, okay? Freud adds in the sexual element. Marx has the constant revolutionary. Marx hated the traditional family. He saw it as against. It was a weapon, a tool used by the bourgeoisie to keep the lower class, the proletariat, down, kept women down, kept them from working. You can read this right in his Communist Manifesto. It's right in there. It's not a long read if you're interested. And so what happens is there's some people who finally start to say, okay, what's going on here? What is humanity's problem? And they're called the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School famously mixed in Marxism and Freudian thought. So what they did is they all assumed that the inner self is good, whatever that appetite is. The oppressive outside self is the bourgeoisie. Now, in sexuality, that means that's what keeps you from expressing yourself in any way you want sexually. And that inner self can only be truly individual, self-authenticated by you following your appetites. Anything outside then, including the nuclear family, is damaging to you finding who you truly are. And that's where we begin to get to this point of the sexual revolution. This predates the sexual revolution. It happens to be a philosophy that is buzzing around, but it hasn't hit mainstream until about the 60s. You add in the postmodern thought of language, of really there being no foundational truth. So the only foundational truth is yourself. Language being used as a means of oppression. That's very Derrida, Foucault. And you end up in the world we kind of are in today. And the reason the sexual revolution takes off is the invention of one very important medical science discovery. Can you guess what that is?
The pill.
100%. When the pill, we think these philosophies just coexist. Without the pill, this just doesn't take off. There's too much consequence, if I can use the word consequence, from just expressing yourself as sexually free as you want. by the time the pill gets discovered, you've got the sexual revolution. You have all of the students from the Frankfurt School are now professors. And they're all around the country. And of course, you get them down in California and all of that. And this whole idea of finding your authentic self becomes the end goal. And now we add into the sexual matrix. And then you can imagine the church holding to a traditional value of sexuality between a man and a woman then becomes an enemy because they're oppressing the self. So biblical concepts of sexuality now become the oppressor. They become the devil in this story, right? So when you run into somebody in contemporary sexual expression, whether that's homosexual or heterosexual, it doesn't really matter. The main point they're going to have is what is the freedom that we offer people? And that is where the debate lies right now. And the debate then is, if I say that there's a certain type of sexuality, I'm literally destroying their humanity because that's their core
You're denying
self.
Existence. Or
100%. Yeah. Their whole existence is located in their sexual self. Nowhere does the Bible say that our location of our authenticity is ourself. Our authenticity is being image bearers of God. So it's a different concept of what does it mean to be human. So this goes right to the core of what does it mean to be human. So the pagans on their part would express themselves sexually as worshipers of their God. And what it meant to be human was that we were tools to turn on the gods, to express ourselves that way. To the modern self, the God is the self. There is no external. But it's just as pagan in the sense of it's all wrapped up around our desires. It's all wrapped up on what humanity thinks is right or good. Go back to the creation narrative. What does the wily serpent say? And you can be God, knowing good from evil. So biblically, this concept of the modern sexual self is demonic. Okay? That's from a biblical perspective. And there's warning after warning after warning about the danger of sexuality becoming misused.
Misuse, okay, yeah.
Misused in that sense of it's a powerful force. You know, the human sexual drive is an incredibly powerful force. Always has been. And the Bible knows that. It's an incredible gift in the sense of it can be so enjoyed, but it has become, as it always has been, a dangerous tool with the wrong ideology. So for a Christian, of course, Jesus Christ came and he says basically they're talking about who will be married to who, and he says, and he just requotes he's quite conservative actually. He requotes the creation story, which would have been pretty standard, the two shall become one flesh. And in that concept, nobody really argues with them in first century Second Temple Judaism, because they did have polygamy, but they had polygamy on in stages because they divorced for anything, right? And so if you didn't like your current partner, and you didn't marry too, like that's the other thing, like it's so hard for us to understand. They didn't marry because of romantic ideals. That's a 19th century idea. They married because of practical reasons, keeping alive, upward mobility. And so divorce was often wrapped up with that. Of course, divorce had incredible social challenges to the woman who's been divorced, because she's become, I don't know the word for it, cursed, maybe.
The communities weren't that big. It's
no,
like
so you knew.
Like, where do you? Like,
yeah.
The villages were pretty small back then too, right? So it's like if you now broke from your family, your spouse, it's like, how do you engage with community? Who's like where do you live? How do you survive?
100%. And well, you'll notice in Jesus' prohibition about divorce, and it's very socially constructed. He talks to men divorcing women, not women divorcing men. They didn't have that option. I mean, it's very sad. And of course, the debate amongst the Pharisees, they were so caring, was about why can we divorce? That was the main issue. And
a bad meal or infidelity, right?
The Shamites famously said if he burns the toast, right, then she deserves a divorce. And the Hillites, to be fair, were more liberal and said, no, she has to go and commit porneia, where we get that word, covenant breaking, and that would be a sexual nature. But what's happened in our culture is that Christians have always believed, as Jews, that we were created in God's image. When you take that out, then what ultimately is going to be the end is self, or a God you make in your image. So the current sexual reality is all wrapped up in what the Bible calls idolatry. Sexuality, then, is biblically a fruit of what you worship. It's not the cause problem. So when people talk about sin and sexual sin, it all leads back to the scriptural idea of not bearing God's image by bearing the image of yourself. And that's what, by the way, Paul does in Romans 1. Romans 1 is an interesting take. He talks and he gets into how did we end up getting here when we were created in God's image? And he talks about us worshiping ourselves, worshiping the things we make. His main point in Romans 1 has nothing to do with homosexuality per se. That's not his main issue. His main issue is idolatry. When he speaks about man actually sleeping with man or woman actually sleeping with woman, which for Paul, you can tell in the writing, like, can you believe this is even happening? Today it's so normalized. What he's trying to say is that demonstrates our idolatry because we're worshiping something made in our image. Do you see where that is? Instead of worshiping the God whose image we're made. Because and then a male, right? Female. They're the image of the self. So there's just no concept scripturally of sexuality outside of a man and woman in a covenant under God being the normal way to bear God's image. Doesn't mean you have to have sex to bear God's image. But if you're going to use this gift, the point is also, frankly, procreation. It's very connected. Jesus is very clear that whatever this gift is, it's not going to be useful in the resurrection because there's no need for procreation in eternity. We get in that really weird conversation about if a woman has 5 husbands they all died, who's married, and he just has a fun time with that.
I think that, like, you're talking about like sexual sin too, like in it. I think it's the word "hatah" is used in when Cain kills Abel. Sin is crouching at the door, ready to consume or devour you. You see some people that have lived, they've gone down this road of sowing their oats, right? And they've created this appetite for sexuality that's just not able to be satisfied. You know, and it's like they're going for the next relationship, from one relationship to the next one, trying to, like, it's like consuming them, you know?
Well, and so I have to bring in my testimony. This is why I don't think we should ever start off talking about homosexuality. It's such a hot topic, right? But you can't understand the current debate around homosexuality outside the larger debate, which the church has failed, by the way. It has failed by saying, oh, yeah, go ahead and sleep with whoever, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But if you're a homosexual, I'm talking the conservative church. Oh, boy, this is the great sin. So my own journey, before I was a Christian, obviously, I was just a typical pagan. You know, I would have saw myself as a pretty nice guy. I mean, I didn't hurt women, and my goal was to be cool. And Sam Malone of the Cheers, you remember about? I don't know if you guys remember that.
Which character was that on Cheers?
He was the guy. He was the womanizer bartender.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So we looked up to that. He was like, oh, he's the ideal, right? And womanizing is this wonderful way of being your true, authentic self. And, of course, it was socially acceptable at the time, where homosexual behavior, by the way, wasn't quite mainstream when I was a kid. But what happened is I go and follow in that as best I can. And when I was able to, go party and stuff, and you'd run into girls, and of course, I had multiple partners by the time I was 20 years old. And that was what I would have told you is the way I was made. That was my authentic self. The idea of being married, to be honest, was horrific to me. The old joke, then you don't eat the same type of ice cream. You've heard these kind of comments every day of your life. I mean, really, it's stupid, but it was who I was, so I can express that. And it was a way to destruction. And I didn't realize my soul was as dead as it was, but it was dead until I have this encounter with Jesus Christ. And one of the most liberating things was to realize that he wants to heal me in every part of my life. And that meant, I'll tell you a funny story of just how stupid I was. I had become a Christian, but I was still with a girl, and we were sleeping together at the time, college, university. And one of my roommates, or not roommates, guy who lived across the hall, came out and had heard me one night, I guess. And he said, well, you're a Christian. You're not supposed to be fornicating. And I didn't know what that meant. So I went into my room, I took out Webster's dictionary and I looked up fornication and I went, "Doh." And so I went to this girl because I thought, oh, she'll quite understand, and she's a good Catholic girl, I had thought. So I went and told her, you know what, we can't have sexual relations anymore based on my faith, and we have to, she broke up with me. So yeah, no, I know, and so part of my journey has been realizing how warped I had been from these experiences and letting God heal me, but it's also making a choice not to act out my natural inclination. And that is something where I made a choice to understand Jesus as the full expression of God, living out that expression of God through the creation story and telling us how to be human. And that has been, sure, it was been a challenge, especially those early years, when I was used to. I understand what you're saying. When you have opened a door, and then you add in the technology that's today, like we didn't have the internet, right? Yeah. So you can only imagine the imagery. If you don't think that people are being affected by that in the waves it is, I was reading somewhere, actually, I think you were telling me this, that the brain changes its chemistry, like its brain waves when you're watching pornography.
I think
there's a physiological thing.
There's lots of books written on it that a few people have mentioned about growing up on a screen and how that changes your brain. Well, like working with guys in addictions for 20 years now, it's like you see a correlation between relationships, like we're talking about sexuality and addiction. And everyone, like the number one predictor of your long-term recovery is how you handle relationships, the person you date. And there's a huge correlation also with technology, like guys coming into programming and into treatment that they're going through like a technological detox, right? It's like, where's my phone? Phantom rings. And
right.
Like, I don't know what to do, right? And it's like, it's
I'm addicted to my phone, so I
yeah, but there's
I
these
need
things
therapy.
that consume us, right? Like
for sure.
Consumer mind, and then anxiety's going up, and
yeah,
other challenges, depression, anxiety's going through the roof. We've never been more connected at any time in history, yet so far away.
Well, I think it's because all these devices allow us is just to continue to celebrate this self, right? Because it can be just you. You can create your own image on here and interact with people. You can be a 35-year-old Asian woman, per se, on here, even if you're not, and that has to have affected our psychology about who we are and what do we identify. I think a big problem we have in the Western church, and I can't speak to the rest of it, is we've lost community too. There was something about community that you, like in the sexual realm, people were responsible for each other for years, and now they're not. People are just doing whatever they want, and now they're finding their dates by swiping right or left. And again, this is post-dates my era. But that affects how you look at the world, how you look at your friends, how you look at community. And
you see community as like a means for your ends. Like these, how can I get what I want from these people, from these women, from these men? Or how can I make the world around me embrace my truth, because it's all about me, rather than denying my own desires or proclivities, my sexual urges or desires to benefit society.
Well, absolutely. And you can see even the way you use that word, my truth, that's that self-authenticated person. And if you stop that at all, then you are oppressing that individual. And that's where the political side of this comes in. And it's become dangerous now to hold, like traditional liberalism would say, you do what you do, I'll do what I do. That's out the door, because now we've added in the Marxist politics, right? Where the awakened person now must be allowed to express themselves in whatever setting they want. And if you don't acknowledge that, you're the oppressor. See, as soon as you do that, famously, I think it was Marcuse, who was a famous Frankfurt philosophical guy who's really got us where we are with this phobia language, said that the idea that the nuclear family or sexuality and a covenant between a man and a woman being the norm was oppressive, okay? So any expression outside of that makes a person distasteful is irrational, okay? So if you see the world normally as sexuality between a man and a woman, and now you run into another form of sexuality and you find it distasteful, you're being irrational, you're phobic, which comes from the Greek word phobia. and phobios, and the idea of fear, irrational fear. And and it's a powerful move, by the way. If you can convince people that your position ideologically is irrationally fear rather than based on a covenant with God, that's a very powerful way. And of course, you add in that postmodern idea that words have power. So what happened to wife and husband? It became partner, because wife and husband has covenantal overtones. By the way, I had somebody introduce me one time, and this is my partner, his partner Ann. I said, no, actually, she's my wife, and the shock on their faces. But see, being a Christian is living out a different worldview, and that will be offensive just by saying that, just by saying she's my wife, I'm her husband, because that language has to do with a covenant. And so when you say that sexuality is between a man and a woman under God, covenant, that's just been what the church has always believed. Even within denominations now, you can be punished because you are politically seen as going against a group of people that identify it in a certain way. Again, I don't have any desire to get into the evils of homosexuality or polygamy or polyamory or any of these things, because the warpedness of my own sexuality, thank God, has been dealt with by the cross, the Christ and the cross. What I'm saying to you, if you want to walk faithfully in Jesus Christ, this is how you're going to do it. If you want to bear God's image and you are a sexual being, Paul says, go out. If your loins burn or whatever he says in 1 Corinthians, and go find somebody. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And we should celebrate that, but be under no any illusion that any other expression of that puts you outside of bearing God's image. And that's what the whole judgment language is about, is that Adam ceases to bear God's image because he tries to be God in and of himself, and Eve. That's when we get the fall. That's what Genesis is all about. And all of the language of human sexuality after that are censuring is because there is this good that's been lost. And in our culture now, to express this as good is now evil. Do you see where this has come? To say this is our good has now become evil because it's phobic. It's you are now this oppressive bourgeoisie in this language. And that's why you can't just coexist. So, and of course, as soon as you make it that I don't agree with this particular aspect of your life, then I hate you. That's a powerful move. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, I don't think I've ever met anyone I agree with everything they believe or do. I don't agree with myself half the time. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, my emotions are all over the place sometimes. And yeah, it's like if everyone did whatever they wanted to do, they indulged whatever desire they had, chaos would ensue in society. Mm-hmm. And so it's just been like a slow fade with sexuality, right? And you know, like back to the addictions thing, like seeing the long-term effects of these types of lifestyles, they're not healthy for the individual. And the food, sex, and safety, like the limbic system, the part of our brain, is connected to all three of those areas, right? Or those three things. And so the lack of stability in relationship is creating more issues for this generation.
Oh, for sure.
Anxiety, depression.
Absolutely.
How do I, like we talked about last time, a lot of these women on these what are they called? Tinder, like those dating sites, it's about a 5% type of guy that they're interested in.
Okay.
And that kind of guy apparently is...
I'm guessing I'm not in that 5%.
Well, it's not the kind of guy that's a good representation of all men. You know,
I'm sure.
You know, and hearing a testimony of a girl, like she had a Tinder date, and while they finished up and the guy's laying in bed, he's already looking for the next hookup, right? And so
that's something, eh?
4 or 5% of
that's so healthy.
So yeah, as a woman, it's like, well, I don't like men. I
Right.
don't like. Well, I wouldn't like that kind of person either, you know. And then vice versa. The reactions, like guys are looking, like, what kind of woman can I trust and be in a relationship with that doesn't just want me for the money or for this?
But you can't critique that man. In our culture, he's just expressing his authentic self.
Right.
You understand? Like you can no more critique him than the person exhibiting homosexual behavior, anything else, because he's just, so that's where we've got ourselves.
Living his best life now.
He's living his best life. And most people would say, and that's what the pornography industry relies on, is that this is your authentic self, feed your appetite, and it's destroying people, marriages it is. Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you a quick story. my wife was working and she had a coworker, kind of a boss, but there were only two of them in this office. And I used to come there, and I was actually just beginning to see Anne at the time. And she was quite a very outgoing lady. And she liked, when she found out I was a minister, she decided she was going to try to make me uncomfortable. So she started telling me her sexual exploits. Well, she had no idea my background, and I wasn't going to tell her, but none of what she told me was overly shocking. She got to the point where she actually once brought a toy in, one of these sex toys, and put it on her desk, and I'm, come on in here, Emery, and made sure it was front. And, I was like, okay, whatever. Anyway, she was into this guy that was a roommate, and they were friends with benefits, which I understand to mean you have sexuality, but you're not in a relationship. See, this whole idea is biblically insane because you are in a covenant. And she used to tell me about Liz and how she'd be choked. Have you heard this? Yeah, she'd be choked in sexual activity and how enhancement this was. All to shock me. I know it was to shock, and I knew it at the time. And she was so proud of herself, and I'd leave. And I'll never forget the day that I came in, and she asked me to come in her office. So I'm ready for this, again, another volley of make Emery feel uncomfortable. Except she's in tears, and she's bawling. And I was shocked, to be honest, because I had not seen even an ounce of this. And then she reflected on how her soul felt like it wasn't there, that she had lost any sense of self, and how she had asked this gentleman who was a roommate who they'd had this, if they could have a deeper, obviously there's going to be something going on deeper than just the physical sex. We're whole human beings. And he quickly said no and went on to door number 2. And to watch the brokenness, and she said, I envy you for your belief. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
I think that's what's the church's witness right now. I think we're not going to win this battle by saying, oh, homosexuality is wrong or polygamy is wrong. All we can do is say this is the way we're made in God's image.
Yeah.
And the best way to interact is just live that out in community, because I do know from my own journey and other people's journey that there is no life. The life comes through Jesus Christ. And when you identify in him, you have to lay down stuff.
Yeah.
You have to carry your cross, because that's where the life is. And I know you've been married many years. I have. Neither of us are perfect.
No. You're pretty close, though.
I'm pretty close, yeah. Well, and this is what I'd say to people. I have no trouble saying this. One of the greatest joys I have in our friendship and friendship with others is to recognize our imperfection, recognize pornography as a lure. Like it is, guys. It is. Mm-hmm. Having covenant eyes together, having this accountability, so that it makes me a much healthier, happier person. And thank God I have a wife that understands my temptations, and she has her own. Like we live in a world.
Those romance novels, they're
yeah, exactly.
Not saying anyone's into that.
It's
out there, right?
Hallmark movies are women's porn. Yeah.
No guy actually acts
no.
that way.
no straight guy.
I heard it was a course called Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage.
Yeah.
There, and the guy, what's his name? I'm forgetting his name. He's a funny dude, anyways. Yeah, it's gone. Anyways, he said when you hear a woman describe the perfect man, she ends up describing another woman.
Yeah.
Right? Tim Keller just passed away.
Tim.
He wrote a book. What a great man. That's unfortunate. Yeah. But he did write a lot of good things. In this book he wrote called The Meaning of Marriage. There's some videos that go along with it. And they interviewed a Christian couple, and a secular couple. They didn't really ascribe to any sort of belief.
Yeah.
And the most intriguing thing that the man of the secular couple said, he said that he envies the methodology of the Christian marriage, or the utility of the Christian marriage. I think he used that term because he said, you guys know what it is.
Yep.
And he said the biggest challenge my wife and I had to figure out, or his spouse and him, is what does marriage mean to you and me, and how do we bridge the gap? What's your family system? What's mine? What's your belief? What's your ideology? How are we going to raise the kids?
Psychotherapeutic culture, right?
And he said, like, when you guys have a challenge in marriage, you have an understanding as how to move forward in it. And then you have people around you, a community that's going to train you and spur you on. And like, I'm being a bit more explanative than he was, but it's like you have people around you to support you and an understanding as to what it is.
Yep.
And culture, like, how do you build a relationship when you don't even know what a relationship is with the person you're like culturally speaking, because there's so much information out there on what truth is and what relationships are, and your truth and the cultural truth. And
well, and here's why people are often surprised, but I have no trouble with gay marriage in the secular system, because that's a different narrative they're living out of. Why would I expect them to, live out of my narrative of sexuality? But I am to bear witness. So local community that I pastor in, we have a certain perspective, and we take that serious. Because they have to figure out what that is. You can imagine two same-sex people, they're going to have to figure out, and the way they look at marriage is not biblically. So,
or you don't want to impose your belief on them, saying you have to live this way.
Well, and you're not going to anyways, right? So I think it's a bad idea whenever we gain, that's a whole other podcast,
right? When
the church uses its power politically. But I do think that the best thing we can do as a witness right now in this time is be in community, okay? You're not going to change Twitter. You're not going to change social media. And act it out. And I truly believe that if you act this out, people will come who's had enough of trying to worship self. That's what I think that we are going to start to see. And right now, it seems like we're losing, but we're not. You're always seems to be... Carrying your cross isn't easy, and it always looks like a loss, but God wins through that loss. So it seems like we're losing all of the battles in the world, but in fact, we are winning in the sense of our narrative is now being demonstrated, juxtaposed to the world. So when we come together and we act out these things together in community, we actually have a witness for the world that probably we didn't even have 50 years ago, where everything was normalized, where cultural Christianity was more normalized. I think what you're going to see is definitely a weaning for a while of people in the church who embrace the world's view, the self. They're already doing it, but it will become less and less popular to be Christian. But then I think there will be a reaction, because this is no way to life.
I think a lot of the cultural Christianity we've observed in our lives, and maybe through history too, is given a veneer of it not working.
Right.
Think of like the abusive relationships, or the people that go to church and and none of us are perfect by any means, but like this idea of cultural Christianity, but without the change aspect. Like I have a testimony too of like when I lived, who I once was to who I am now is very different, and it's been a lot of dying to self, and my wife and I being married as long as we have, like I mentioned before, like we statistically shouldn't be married considering our stories, right? And I think that's a testimony to God, and we've barely made it through it certain times, right?
Oh,
it's hard. I'm selfish. I'm kind of a jerk sometimes, like
you are.
I am. and so it's like to have grace for one another, and knowing that my wife loves me when I make mistakes.
Sure.
And I love her when she makes mistakes. I think is a great testimony, right? It allows me to come back to the table.
Well, and again, you're living out a foundationally different narrative there, and so am I, and that's why it's working. And I think that that's what we can offer, and that's what this podcast is about: is to look at woke ideology, but not just critique it. There is a better story. There is. Yeah. And I have no trouble saying it. Now, they hate to say that because they hate narratives that dominate. But the truth is, the narrative I have tells me that Emery's self isn't the end, that there's someone greater. So we should end with this reading of this text.
Okay.
I'm going to, I think I'll just start right here. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true, and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, "Awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise as wise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is."
Awesome.
Thanks,
Emery.
All right.
Feel free to subscribe and share.
Yes, please.
Listen.
We need to get over that YouTube algorithm thing.
We had 100 subscribers to get in the algorithm, you're saying.
Yeah. That's what I heard. I don't
Awesome.
know.
Have a great day.
Bye.